Hello, beer theologians. This is Around the Word in Many Glasses. Today, we'll be drinking Krombacher Dark, and we'll be talking about Genesis chapters 1 and 2. So sit back, relax, pour yourself a drink. Let's get into it. So today I have another German beer. I promise I drink things that aren't just German beers, but this is another one that I have. Another beer, actually, that was a gift to me. This one, however, was not a gift from a church member. So it was a gift from a friend of Lauren and I's. They gave it to me. I say me because my wife's pregnant, so she can't be drinking beer right now. Because we were watching her or their daughter, and their daughter is, as she said, semi potty trained, and so as a special thanks for dealing with that, she bought me dark German beer, which I will take no matter what. So this is the beer I'm drinking today. I just finished pouring it, so I can give it a try. I don't have a whole lot of a story about this one. Cheers! It's just a great, dark, malty beer. It's a little bit different because it's a German beer. At least when I think dark beers, I tend to think more like England and, well, the stuff that's made in the United States, stuff like stouts and porters. And this isn't quite that. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's got definitely kind of that German style to it. Don't really know a good way to describe what exactly that is. If you've had a lot of German beers, you can kind of tell. It's like something that kind of almost catches at the back of your mouth, and this one has it, but it's still nice and dark, malty. It's a great beer. She did an excellent job in choosing it, and I'm very grateful to have it. I don't want to spend too much time on the beer today because I want to get into the topic for today. So, where this is coming from, other than just being the beginning of the Bible, is that in probably November of 2020, decided to put together a reading plan for the Bible, to read through the Bible in a year. Now, I had and have tried a number of reading plans for the Bible. I've tried a 2 year plan, a 1 year plan. I tried a 3 month plan, which actually went better than I would have thought it would have, of all going through the whole Bible, but I didn't get through any of them. I did a couple of thematic sorts of Bible plans, right? So read through the Kings or something like that. Read through the prophets or the Gospels or things like that. And while I will say, as a disclaimer, I have read the entire Bible, I do think any pastor who hasn't read the whole Bible needs to immediately stop what they're doing and hit the book, for that matter. But I've never been able to stick to a plan. And so you might be wondering, if you've never stuck to a plan, why in the world are you writing a reading plan? Well, I wrote this reading plan for people like me, people who go into almost always the new year. Let's just be honest. These are all of those reading plans for just about New Year's resolutions. But people like me who go into reading plans with such great intentions, and get a little bit into them and then just fall behind. It only takes 1 or 2 days in a lot of these daily plans, and you fall, one day behind, and then you think, oh well, that's okay. I'll just double up one of the days, and you never do. And then you fall another day behind, and then sooner or later you're 15 days behind, and you just give up. At least that was my experience in reading plans. So I wrote this reading plan for people like me, people who have good intentions, but find themselves falling behind for all sorts of reasons that really shouldn't get in the way, but because this is real life, reasons that do get in the way. So it's a unique reading plan. Doesn't get you through the whole Bible. Well, it does and it doesn't. The reading plan I put together will get you through the whole scriptures, but almost like a Cliff Note version, right? It hits the highlights through the Old Testament and the New Testament. I will use this as an opportunity, I think, to try and figure out how to put a link to a document in a YouTube description. So my attempt is to actually put this reading plan in the description if you'd like to join along. And my plan is to do weekly videos so that I will have an extra reason to read through the assigned reading, the reading I assigned myself for any given week. I've already had a couple of my youth mentors who said that they were going to do the reading plan, and so I've already told them, hey, and I've told my youth as well, even though they may or may not be doing it, hey, you guys get to ask me every Sunday if I've kept up with my reading. So hopefully between being shamed by the high schoolers at my congregation and having a video to make about each reading, hopefully that'll actually keep me on track. But we'll see how it goes. Like I said, I'm going to try and put the description or the reading list in the description. But in addition to only being select portions of scripture, it's not a daily reading plan. Those are, for me at least, too easy to fall behind on. And so what I did instead is I made a weekly reading plan. And quite frankly, they're not big sections of scripture, so you have even less excuse to not do it. For the first week, which technically was 9 days because I didn't count the first couple of days in January as its own week. It's just 2 chapters, Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And I think, and it's been a while since I've looked at it, I think there is, I think the longest section is actually the Psalms of Ascent, which I have for the Psalms week, which is like 14 chapters. Probably the longest unit is the Exodus account, which is 10 chapters. It's a little bit longer chapters, but it's a story, so it should be easier to get through. So not only that, but I have built-in weeks for catch-up. So there are weeks where there is no assigned reading. That way, you don't need to worry if you're like me and you do end up falling behind. You don't need to worry about doubling up on a week. Instead, you just wait till that catch-up week and you just work through because you've already taken your week off whenever you, for whatever reason, didn't do the readings. So, as I said, this first week is Genesis chapters 1 and 2. And it's this is probably going to be the most different and unique of all of these that I do, maybe with the exception of next week with, I think it was Genesis 3 and 4. Simply because I've taught this so many times. Partly because it's the beginning of Scripture, and partly because creation is a really hot topic. This is a section of Scripture that I have taught time and time and time and time and time again. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot packed into it. I actually just finished rereading it just to make sure everything was fresh in my mind. And there's an enormous amount of content, if you will, just jam-packed into these 2 chapters. And then, of course, the chapter 3 certainly is also a pretty jam-packed chapter of Scripture. So we certainly are not going to deal with every section that we could. Honestly, we could probably stretch Genesis 1, 2, and we'll just include 3 for the sake of this comment. We would probably stretch just looking at those 3 chapters over about 10 weeks or so of full-blown Bible study. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of do a broad overview. Again, this is how I typically begin to approach Genesis 1 and 2 when I teach it. So if you're if you're a member at Rivercliff and you've been in any of my confirmation classes, or I've taught on this in any of the classes you're in, this may be pretty familiar to you, but I guess you and I will both get to go through it together again. So as you read through Genesis 1 and 2, just about everyone notices something a little bit strange. Well, they may or may not notice it their first time around, but the story isn't written in what I tend to refer to as a Greek style, right? The Greek style is what we're all used to, at least all of us in the Western world. We're used to a story, for the most part, beginning at the beginning and then going to the next part and then the next part and then next and then finishing at the end. It's a linear story. Now, I know literature can play around with this. For the most part, that's uh, the way stories are told in the Western world. Um, Genesis doesn't work that way. If you're surprised by this, it's probably worth noting that the Bible's not a Western book. It is not a book written by people with a Western Greek mindset. You get a little bit of a Greek mindset in the New Testament simply because of Hellenization and all of that ball of wax that has gone on. But even in the New Testament, you still see this Hebrew way of telling stories. And they don't tell stories in a straight line. At least they very rarely do. They certainly will. Instead, what they do is they make circles for their stories, kind of concentric rings. So this is where having a whiteboard would be useful. We're going to try and use our imaginations for this. Maybe the drinking will help loosen the mind in that respect. So think of it like this. There's a point that the author is making, right? So it is the story, if you will. And the story's resting kind of here. What the Hebrew author will do is they'll approach that story and then they'll make a lap around it, focusing on one aspect of the story. And then they'll make another loop, and then another loop, and another loop, with each loop focusing on something different. Maybe even pushing the narrative along a little bit, but they will have a greater emphasis on something. They'll be narrowing in on something. They'll be looking at something different altogether, all in about the same event, right? Their story arcs go in circles. And this happens in Genesis. Famously, or maybe infamously, it also happens at the end of the Bible in Revelation, where John makes almost 7 loops around the time between Christ's ascension and Christ's return. And this confuses a lot of people, because if you read Revelation in the straight line like a Greek would read Revelation, you're going to get really confused with things like a tribulation, a rapture, multiple returns of Christ. It just, the story doesn't work. But if you look at it as concentric circles, then it does. Then it all fits together. One of my high schoolers, actually, I recently taught Revelation, so I discussed this with them, had a great illustration to kind of help understand this. The Hebrew way of telling stories, let's assume that there are 3 circles, which we'll get to. I think there are in the Genesis account. Well, let's say there are 3 circles. The author makes 3 loops around his point. That first loop is kind of like watching a football game from the blimp camera, right? It's this broad overview, and you can see a lot, right? You can see how many people are in the stands. You can see stuff that's even happening outside of the stadium, and for the most part, you can see the game as well, although you're not going to get a whole lot of details, right? It's a broad picture. The second loop could be something similar to like the cameras up in the stands, right? More detail, more focus on the game. They're able to follow the track of the football a little bit more, and you're still able to see the crowd a little bit. But a different focus, different details come out. But they also lose some that the blimp had, right? You get no real sense for how many people are at the game, and you get no real sense of what's going on outside of or around the stadium. So you lose some, but you get some more details coming in. And then that third loop would be kind of like the guy standing in the end zone, the one that always gets run over as the players come through to score their touchdowns, right? He gets a great view, amazing detail of the game, and completely misses the crowds, but you're able to get more. And then as we watch football, right, or whatever sport used for the metaphor, we combine all 3 of these types of shots, and we're able to get a good, broad overview and kind of get a sense of everything that's happening. The Hebrew way of telling a story is very similar. And so you'll see, well, we'll talk specifically about the Genesis account, but with each loop that the author is making, he has a different emphasis. He's giving you a different camera angle, though he's still looking at the same thing. So like I alluded to, I'd straight up said it. I think there are 3 circles in the Genesis account. I'll be honest, I don't know of anyone else who has said this, which is a dangerous position to be in, to be sure. because you never want to be the only person thinking something. But I've also never had anyone that I've explained this to say that I'm completely crazy about this. So because I think there are three. Most people tend to think that there are just two. By the way, if you've ever heard of a I guess Old Testament, it's not really there, character, legendary figure called Lilith, that's where this is coming in. It's a misunderstanding of the fact that Moses is telling this story in more than one different way. I'll leave that for your own research, but it's fascinating what this misinterpretation has come up with. Really interesting, but has no real biblical merit. I think there are three creation accounts in the book of Genesis. I think the first creation account we all know, and in fact we all have memorized, or at least many of us have memorized. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's it, right? Moses has told us the whole story, right? Because you'll note, as soon as he continues on with the rest of the creation account, the earth and the heavens, for that matter, disappear, and they get recreated. And so I think Moses has given us a one-sentence, a one-line creation account. Quite frankly, in many ways, it's all we need to know. In the beginning, God created, right? It tells us a little bit about God, who he is, and the fact that he is responsible for everything we have around us, everything that we see. God created everything. And he could have left it there and just moved on. But he had more details that he wanted to bring out. There were more important things for Moses to tell us. And so he finishes the loop, right? He starts his story over again, which is where we get the 7 days of creation, right? With that familiar refrain, there was evening and there was morning, the first day, the second day, the whatever number day it is. And so let's spend a little bit of time on that. And then we can get on to what the third cycle, or what most people think is the second cycle. Most people just leave off that first one as maybe an introductory statement. But I think it's worth saying, you got everything in there. What we see in the 6 days of work and then the day of rest and creation, quite frankly, there's a lot in there that I'm just going to be breezing over most of it. But what I want to do is I want to kind of lay out the beautiful symmetry of the actual act of creation that that God had. So if you've ever been on Jeopardy or something, you've been asked, what did God make on the whatever day of creation, and you've thought, oh, how will I ever remember that? This is how you remember it. It's really easy once you kind of know the trick, if you will. Again, we need to imagine a whiteboard here with 2 columns of 3, because we can split the creation into 2 halves. The first half is the first 3 days, and the second half are the second set of 3 days. And so we'll note what God is creating on each of those days. So on the first day, God creates light and dark. On the second day, God creates the sky and the seas. On the third day, God creates the earth and the trees. Right? He brings the land up from the midst of the waters, and he separates the waters. Well, the waters are separated on the second day when he forms the sky and the oceans. And if you can remember that, you can remember the rest of it. It's probably worth noting that God is making out of nothing, right? He's creating through his spoken word, which is something I think I've actually already talked about a little bit on this channel, something that will definitely come up more, the significance of God creating, to use the Latin, ex nihilo, out of nothing, through the power of the logos, to use some Greek, debar and Hebrew, or that word coming forth from the mouth of God. But we'll talk about that at some point in a lot of details, because that's a pretty huge theme, a huge Christological theme, if we're going to kind of just give you a little bit to go by here. So God creates light and dark. He creates the sky and the sea, and he creates dry land and the trees. That's day 1, 2, and 3. That's our first column. And then we have symmetry, right? So in the first 3 days, God, you can almost think of paints with a broad brush, right? He lays foundations, the foundations of creation, you might want to call them, right? On the second 3 days, he goes in with that fine detail. He fills them in. He gives those things shape and purpose and life in many instances. So on the first day, God created light and dark. On the fourth day, he formed that light and that darkness. He created the sun, the moon, and the stars. Right? He took what he made on the first day and he worked on it some more. Right? He gave it shape. So the first day is light and dark. The fourth day is the sun, moon, and stars. The second day is the sky and the sea, and you might be able to guess what the fifth day is at this point. It's the birds and the fish. He's filling up these things that he has created on the earth. I guess well, there is land at this point, but he's filling them up with life. Our God is a God of life. He's not a God of death, which is an important point when we discuss how old the earth is and how mechanisms of creation, especially the mechanism of creation of life, comes in. At least I think that's the most critical point. We'll probably deal with that before we're finished here today. So on the first day he created light. On the fourth, light and dark. On the fourth day he created the sun, moon, and the stars. On the second day he created the sky and the sea. On the fifth day, I'm getting my numbers mixed up here, the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. On the third day, he brought forth the land and the trees. And then on the sixth day, he created all of the animals, crowning his creative achievement with humanity, with mankind. And we see in this, the second round, that Moses makes the point. God created them male and female. We have both genders. There's no distinction in how humanity is made. We have no real reason to believe that man was created in any other way than by speaking. Now, we'll find out in the third cycle that we get more details about that. And of course, at the end of the sixth day, there's a bit of a change in the refrain. For every other day, God looked at all he had created and he saw that it was good. But on the sixth day, God looks at everything he has created, and he says it is very good. There's a superlative aspect to the sixth day, and that is because he creates humanity. He creates this creature in his own image, the crowning achievement of creation. What might be interesting, at least to drive the point home here, is, well, one, we don't know when angels were created. We know that they were created. We don't know when. The Bible, Moses, doesn't tell us. But what we do know, partly from the creation account, and partly from other sections of Scripture, the beginning of Hebrews is another major portion where we see this, but angels are not the crowning achievement of God's creation. Humanity is. In the taxonomy of creatures, if you will, humans are above angels. And so for those who think that the angels are greater than us, or that we, when we die, become angels, which is a strange thought. It's not in the Bible at all. And in fact, to become an angel after death would be a very significant demotion. It would be kind of like becoming a dog after we died. And I know dogs are completely wonderful creatures, and in many cases are better than most of us. But as far as God's taxonomy of creation goes, they're below us. Humanity is absolutely at the top. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have the responsibility to the creatures. In fact, the whole topic I wasn't planning on talking about, but this idea of headship is those who are greater are serving the least, right? Jesus talks about that once or twice. And so we, as the humanity, that is, as the heads of creation, as the crowning achievement, it's our job to look after this place, to take care of it. So this being put as the crowning achievement of creation gives us more responsibilities, not a tyrant's crown that we can wear or anything like that. So that kind of concludes the second cycle of creation, if you will. But then Moses makes another lap. And so we see between the first cycle and the second Moses gives us a very broad overview of creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But then he says, well, let's go back. Let's take a look at this. Let's get some more details about what's going on. Let's look at how God created. And of course, I'm just realizing I didn't even talk about the seventh day. For now, let's just leave it at on the seventh day, God rested. That rest should remind us of paradise and the heaven that is awaiting us on what theologians call the eighth day of creation. Sabbath and eighth day of creation, I'll talk about some other time. I don't want to deal with that today. It's a bit, it's not quite germane to the conversation. But we'll table those for another time. But then between the second and the third cycle, Moses kind of zooms in. Really, he has a very tight focus. His focus is only on one day of creation, that sixth day. He looks at that crowning achievement and looks at us and says, let me tell you how you were made. Because how humanity was made is critically important. It establishes how society functions. It establishes order in creation. It establishes headship and where humanity is in relation to creatures and where humanity is in relation to one another. And so we zoom in and we see that the creation of Adam, where God doesn't just speak him into existence. Rather, God, to anthropomorphize God here, kind of gets down in the dust, in the mud, in the dirt, and breathes life into this being that he molds and shapes. By the way, here, this is one of the primary places that we get what's known as the bipartite division of man, which is a whole other thing that we could talk about that some people make a very big deal and make a lot of. I think it's a matter of interesting debate, something for people who write papers to talk about for the most part. But this division of man in between body and soul. And what's important to note is that Adam, when he was just body, when he was just the dust of the earth, was not a man. And when he was just the breath of God, that spirit that God breathed out, he was not a man. It wasn't until those two came together in a union that should never be separated, did Adam become a man. And here's where we see, quite frankly, the horrors of death. Theologically speaking, and there are medical ways of identifying this as well, of which I know that they exist. I don't know what they are because I'm a theologian, not a doctor. But theologically speaking, death occurs at the point where the soul and the body are ripped apart. When that happens, you are dead, to put it bluntly. And we'll probably talk at some point about death and what happens at that point. But what we can say very briefly here is the body goes back into the earth. Dust you are, to dust you shall return. And the spirit goes to rest in what I prefer to call the bosom of Abraham. We'll talk about this at some point, I'm sure. But that's not the end, right? Because you are less than when you die. When your two component parts are taken apart, you are less than. Now, don't get me wrong. That intermittent state where you are a disembodied spirit resting in Abraham's bosom is a good place to be. But it's not, you're not whole. And so that's why Christians push so hard and focus so heavily on the resurrection, where God will take that body out of the ground, will take that spirit from its resting place, and he'll recreate both of them and smash them back together so that you can finally become a true human again, one without sin. But that's end time stuff. That's resurrection stuff. Awesome stuff, but not really what we're dealing with here. But we see elements of it with this two-part creation of man. Quite famously, then, God sees that Adam is alone and that there is no helper suitable for him, and so he creates a helper, drawing Eve from the side, from the rib of Adam, bringing him forth a bride. And I'm going to leave the headship discussion, which I'm sure we'll have over time here, at, well, quite frankly, where I left it with humanity over creation. The head is supposed to be the one serving the most, right? We so often, well, in fact, humanity in general likes to flip this one on its head. To be in power is to crush those beneath you, right? To be the head of something is to smash down those who are serving. When in reality, it should be exactly the opposite. And we see a beautiful picture of this with Christ and his bride, the church. We see that Christ is the head of the church. Christ is the bride, the bridegroom of his bride, the church, and yet Christ dies on behalf of the church. And we actually have a really awesome parallel between Christ and the rib that Adam that was taken out of Adam to form Eve. Just as Eve, the bride of Adam, was created from this wound in the side of Adam, we see that the bride of Christ, the church, is created and even fed by the wound that entered into Christ, gushing forth both blood and water, in which we can certainly see elements of the sacraments, communion and baptism there. But again, that's a whole conversation for another day. But the intention here is that the head serves, even to the point of death if need be, those who are under it. Right? The master is supposed to be the servant of those who are beneath him. The husband is supposed to be the servant of the wife. The parents are supposed to be the servant of the child. The government is supposed to be the servant of the people. We can take any sort of power relationship in humanity and recognize how very often it falls far short and, in fact, gets flipped up on its head. And it's absolutely horrible when this happens. When parents are abusive to their children, when husbands are abusive to their wives, and governments are abusive to their people, we recognize very readily that this is not how it's supposed to be. But I think oftentimes we're hesitant to recognize, well, the opposite then should be true. In a correct relationship, it's the one who has authority that needs to be the servant of the one who's not in authority. The head serves the body, not the other way around. Now, there's reciprocation that goes in there, but we can talk about that again another day. Man, I have a lot of things I'm going to need to talk about eventually on this channel, so you guys better keep watching so that I feel inspired to keep doing this. Even though, quite frankly, I'm just enjoying making these videos. I don't actually, at this point, care if anyone watches them, because I'm having an absolute blast, and I hope you are too. So I think we can leave it. I think we can leave it there. We can recognize the major elements, right? The overview of creation. Again, we can take incredibly deep dives into really any of these topics. But I think for today, I mean, I'm almost out of beer, so I think we need to just about call it for today so that we can leave it there to digest. Like I said, I'm gonna try and figure out how to put a Word document or a link to a Word document in the YouTube comments. So if you are not a member at Rivercliff and you'd like to participate or go through this reading plan, that you'll have access to it. If for whatever reason I can't figure that out and you don't see a link in the description, send me an email. I have an email for this YouTube channel. It's wordinmanyglasses@gmail.com. So if for whatever reason it's not there and you would like to have access to this reading plan, just shoot me an email. It is set up specifically for 2021 with the dates, but there's absolutely no reason why you can't just take it week 1, week 2, week 3 in any given year. Additionally, you can always start this late. I think in the whole month of January, there's only about 10 chapters to read. I might be a bit short on there, but we don't get out of the book of Genesis in January, so don't worry about that. Even if you're starting late, you have plenty of time to catch up. And like I said, there are catch-up weeks, so you can always do that. So I'll try and put that in the description. Also, if you are watching this and you have any questions, I covered a huge amount of of ground today, and I left a lot out. I also started an enormous number of conversations and then just left them sitting there. So, if you have a question about anything I said or anything that's in the text that I didn't talk about, again, leave a comment. At some point, I'll get a comment and figure out how to respond and make sure I do all that. Um, yeah, I hope you've enjoyed our time in Genesis 1 and 2. I pray that I actually continue with this, and that this is the year that I finish out a reading plan that I start. But until then, all who wait on the Lord, raise a glass and let us drink to Christ's imminent return.